All right, welcome back, everyone, to the last panel. I'm Samuel Moyn. I teach here. I will be chairing this panel. It'll be somewhat different. It's a roundtable. It was mentioned earlier that to save liberalism, we may need to get together and study the Talmud, but for the purposes of the conference, at least, these are our final sages. And they're obviously acclaimed journalists whom we're very privileged to have here. Instead of giving any lectures or statements, I'll just be reposing the questions that I think have arisen through the course of the conference so far to them. And then you'll have the chance about halfway through to pose your own questions if I've missed any or you have new ones. So let me introduce them first. I'll just proceed in alphabetical order, starting with Zack Beauchamp, who is a senior correspondent at Vox, where he covers challenges to democracy in the United States and abroad, right-wing populism, and the world of ideas. And he's the author of the book, The Reactionary Spirit. Next, to my left is M. Gessen, who, like the last person to my left, Michelle Goldberg, is an opinion columnist for the New York Times. M. Gessen is a distinguished professor at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY and a board member of Jewish Currents. They won the George Polk Award for In the Shadows of the Holocaust, an essay on the use of Holocaust memory to justify the killing in Gaza, which also nearly cost them the 2013 Hannah Arendt Prize for Political Thought, an episode to which I believe we will have to return in the course of the conversation. 2023. Oh, okay. I don't know who wrote this, but I assure you it says 2013. Michelle Goldberg, 2025, is an opinion columnist. She's been doing since 2017 at the Times. She writes about politics and culture with a particular interest, an emerging theme, in the rise of authoritarianism here and abroad, also the evolution of gender relations. She's written several books, including Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, and she is an on-air contributor at MSNBC. Last but not least, looming above us is Adam Gopnik, who has been a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine since 1986. He won the National Magazine Award for essays and for criticism 3 times, as well as the George Polk Award for magazine reporting. He's written in defense of liberalism, notably in his 2019 book, 1,000 Small Sanities, The Moral Adventures of Liberalism, and he drew to my attention on some of our topics for today, the Irving Abella lecture at the University of Toronto he recently delivered, and which you can find online, which is about the transition from anti-Semitism to anti-urbanism, which I'm sure he will want to talk about. So to begin, I won't always call on people, and please feel you can intervene on any question, but maybe it's worth beginning with Zack. We've been debating through the conference just how we should appraise how damaging and what the incidence of anti-Semitism is in America is now on campuses and in general. As we all know, Harvard University dropped its reports actually, but one on anti-Semitism a couple of days ago, and the vibe of that report is that it's very bad. On the other hand, Dan Schwartz, a great historian who's joined us, reflected earlier in the conference of whether it wasn't always perceived as bad, or at least kind of significant, and it's easy to forget earlier crises of anti-Semitism. David Sorkin and Rebecca Coburn both referenced how, for American Jews, our sense of exceptionalism has often led us to downplay the importance of anti-Semitism and its endurance and its implacability. And Frank Foer mentioned in his intervention that a few decades ago, American Jews, in spite of outbreaks of anti-Semitic violence, were running victory laps for the elimination of anti-Semitism. So just to begin, why don't you tell us how serious a phenomenon is it here and now?
So I'm going to start with a story. So on the ride over here from LaGuardia Airport, I had a lot of time in the car, and we were passing time, the driver and I, and he asked me what I was doing, and I told him, I'm going to a conference on anti-Semitism at Yale. And he said, so I have a question for you. Where's the line between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? And I'm like, okay, this is a very reasonable question. Let's have a conversation. About 10 minutes later into this conversation, he is yelling at me that the Jews control the banks and the Jews did 9/11. No, actually real. And the Jews control the media, which I had already told him I was a journalist and I was wearing a kippah. So I felt like I had some authority to opine on the subject, and I told him there's no conspiracy. I would know, I promise. And he looks at me and he says, well, he's driving, so that was a little bit concerning in and of itself. But he looks at me and he says, well, that's just how you're trained to think. We then ended the conversation with him defending the merits of Louis Farrakhan for a long time. Now, I wanted to get in the Farrakhan point, not just to illustrate, where this came from, but because our stereotypes about what modern anti-Semitism is and where it comes from are highly conditioned by the milieus in which we live and the headlines that we see in the newspapers that we write. And so this is, it's not our fault as journalists, but it's a little bit our fault that there's so much focus on what happens on college campuses, which is not to say that it does not matter, that it's not important, that there isn't a significant issue on college campuses. I'm not trying to downplay any of that. But what I am saying is that anti-Semitism is embedded in multiple different sectors of American society in a variety of different ways. There's a very good study by Eitan Hirsch and Laura Royden, who are political scientists at Tufts, documenting the various different ways and places in which anti-Semitism is embedded quantitatively. I think the results are very counterintuitive. It is primarily embedded on the political right in the United States, and incidence is specifically highest among Black and Latino conservatives, self-identified. This is not the form of anti-Semitism that we're used to talking about, not on college campuses, and not in the Trumpist variety either. But I think when we talk about a new era of anti-Semitism, the thing that bothers me the most, right, and the thing that I find personally most concerning, and not only just because it's led to actual, murders of Jews in the largest number, is violence that's ideologically aligned with the current government. I mean that because the government not just has force at its disposal, but because the ability of the President of the United States to disperse messages, to influence the way that public discourse operates, and to shape the way that people think is unparalleled. And that, to me, is, I think, the starting point of a serious conversation about the nature of anti-Semitism in the United States begins with where power lies, who wields it, and where it comes from. And so when we talk about the crisis of anti-Semitism, I do want to talk about things like the Harvard Report. It's not unimportant. It does matter how professors and students feel on college campuses. But what makes this moment, I think, so uniquely perilous is the fact that the President of the United States routinely engages in anti-Semitic stereotyping, often under the guise of philo-Semitism, and is backed by a movement on social media that uses that and knows that it's cover for anti-Semitism. If you'd like proof, I would dare you to go on X for a short period of time and tweet about Jewish topics. You'll see what I mean. Tweet. That's true. I really think that if we are to start talking about this, we need to start with this understanding of power, where it comes from, where it lies, and how influence is distributed.
Can I just add a couple of things to that? First of all, it's striking to me that the person to have most clearly posed the question about the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in the course of this conference is the taxi driver that Zack was with on his way here. And I find that concerning. I also find that concerning in the Harvard Report, which fails to address that question. But there's something else which bolsters Zack's point in the coverage of the Harvard Report. The newspaper where we work reported on, and we don't work for the news site, reported on the level of anti-Semitism at Harvard, the reported level of anti-Semitism, as concerning and clearly major news. And the level of anti-Muslim sentiment and aggression experienced by students. And in both cases, the methodology was the same. It's self-reported, which is, according to the reports, roughly twice the level of anti-Semitism. As something that's that is lower down in the story and that is clearly less remarkable and described in less emotional terms. And there's a reason for that. It's not news. Whereas this particular kind of anti-Semitism that is felt on college campuses is news. And we kind of have to correct for that.
Michelle, did you want to weigh in? Sure.
Well, I would first say, I mean, Zack said, that it was perhaps counterintuitive that most of the anti-Semitism is on the right. I feel like that's only counterintuitive if you are really immersed in these debates about colleges and universities. Because if you are, kind of at all attuned to, well, if you are on social media, but also just if you're at all attuned to right-wing politics, to the records of some of the people in this administration, including the head of the anti-Semitism task force, who retweeted a literal neo-Nazi gloating about how Donald Trump had the power to take away Chuck Schumer's quote-unquote Jew card. It's extremely obvious that this administration, although philo-Semitic in certain ways and kind of certainly extremely pro-Israel, is just saturated both with, obviously with stereotypes about Jews that have different valences depending on where you sit. There's certainly people in this administration who think that Jews, have kind of inordinate financial power, but they see that as something that's admirable and that therefore you should cultivate them. But there's also there's a phrase that you'll sometimes hear in these milieus is the moral myth of World War II, which is they basically think that so much of modern American liberalism has been built on this kind of romantic anti-fascism, and they want to destroy the foundations of that because they think that has, and I actually think that they're right in thinking that has created a taboo around the sort of politics that they would like to institute. And so that's the reason that you increasingly see Holocaust deniers on, Joe Rogan, the biggest podcast in the country, Tucker Carlson, who is either the second or third biggest podcast in the country. And you also see, I think, among Jewish institutions and kind of certain Jewish leaders, either a blindness to this or a willingness to make excuses. So you saw, Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, was willing to write off Elon Musk's, let's call it a Roman salute, in a way that he would have never written it off if that had come from an undergraduate at Columbia University. And so I think that there's two things that are going on simultaneously. I mean, we're not going to disentangle this question of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism here. And there's obviously, if you envision it as a Venn diagram, there's certainly a place where they overlap, but they're not completely overlapping by any means. And because we have a discourse in which they're treated as indistinguishable, in which they're treated as synonymous, it vastly overstates where the locus of actual anti-Semitism is, because it basically because I think that, forgive me, but I don't remember the questioner before who was talking about the undergraduates, but I think a lot of undergraduates look at what's happening in Gaza, feel genuinely horrified and scandalized. And that the resulting uprising, although it's taken, certain forms that I think are regrettable and counterproductive and ugly in certain cases, there's legitimacy to the cause. And if you don't want to admit that there's legitimacy there, Then you have to say, well, where did all this come from? It's all this out of control anti-Semitism that we need the force of the state to help us deal with. And so we're now in this completely bizarre situation where the most anti-Semitic administration of my lifetime is trying to crush institutions in which liberal Jews thrive in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, right? It's a level of perversity that I don't know that like previous authoritarian movements have ever equaled.
Adam, did you want to make an opening statement?
Thank you all for tolerating my, I guess, Wizard of Oz life. Delighted to be here, and I wish I could be with you in person, and I've mounted as a talisman behind me a portrait of the young Marx Brothers when they were just beginning, looking indistinguishable from Italian anarchists of the same period. I'm delighted to be here, and I've read and know some of my fellow panelists, and I'm delighted to be with them. Just one thought. It's certainly true when we're focusing in this conversation, what I heard earlier today, on the crisis of anti-Semitism in the American once liberal state. But if I could bring something to this conversation, it seems to me what's so striking is how remarkably hardy and in many respects unchanging anti-Semitism can be. And I say that with reference to the two other countries that I know best, France and Canada. One of the really remarkable things, it seems to me, is that if you look, as Moyn Samuels has demonstrated, at the anti-Semitism of the Dreyfus Affair at the time of Drummond and so on, it's directed in a remarkable way at exactly the same issues that come up in contemporary anti-Semitism. And that is not that the Jews are an under-people, that they're subhuman in some way, which is the way most bigotry and racism gets expressed. Think of, the hideous Haitian slander. They eat cats and dogs. They're subhuman in some way, uncivilized. Jews are always pictured as being, in a certain sense, superhuman, uber civilized, and they prosper best in meritocratic, liberal societies where they can take advantage of the possibility of advancement by examination. Dreyfus was not hated primarily because he was, not only because he was a Jew, but because he was a captain. He had advanced himself in the system. To prep for this afternoon, one of the things I did was read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is well worth reading because it's really about advancing your kids through a meritocratic system. Make them doctors, make them lawyers, and you'll outcompete the Goyim. And it seems to me that that's the very peculiar and particular valence, if you like, of anti-Semitism that separates it in many respects from other kinds of bigotry. Even in my native country of Canada, which is famously and appropriately seen as being a model, pluralistic and liberal country, there's a history, a horrific history in the 1930s of rejecting Jewish refugees, not because they weren't worthy of Canada, but because they would all explicitly congregate in the cities and form themselves into an intellectual elite. And that, I think, is the peculiar valence of anti-Semitism that no comparable form of bigotry participates in. And as a consequence, if I can make a pugnation statement, it seems to me that we flirt dangerously with the basic template of European anti-Semitism when we, as liberals ourselves, engage in an anti-elitist form of argument. In other words, when we participate in the idea that there's something inherently suspect about a hyper-educated class. And it seems to me that that is exactly the template of classic European anti-Semitism, which we must not allow to contaminate our own way of thinking.
Okay, so just now, Adam, and maybe a little bit earlier, Zack, have emphasized the kind of continuity of at least many of the classic themes in anti-Semitism, and for sure that's right. One of the, I think, interesting emphases of the conferences I've heard it has been on something maybe new, and Michelle called it Trump's philo-Semitism, but since the first panel on Paul Honnebrink's intervention on Orban, it's been kind of more regularly at the conference called anti-Semitism. And with perfect timing, Michelle, you devoted your last column to this phenomenon. Thanks. And I just wanted everyone to kind of reflect on it. So this would be the fact that illiberal forces are finding a political cause in the opposition to anti-Semitism. Whether or not it's new, I mean, is it totally opportunistic? And how do you read it more generally?
I mean, I don't know if it's totally opportunistic as much as I think it's just primarily anti-Muslim, right? It's we have a common enemy, and so it's two things. It's one, it's anti-Muslim, and then there's an even darker reading, which is that if you really do want to kind of purify the nation and you don't want to go as far as a final solution, well, you need the Jews to go somewhere. You need them to go to their homeland. And so, I think that there's a lot of people who see Israel at its most brutal as an example that they would very much like to follow in their own countries. But I think that the parallel, or the analogy, not even the analogy, the precedent of what people used to call homo nationalism is in some ways instructive. And that's what I wrote about in this column. So I'm not a historian, but I am old. And some of you might remember in the earlier part of the 2000s, there was often an argument that you would hear. It really started on the European left. You would hear it a lot in the Netherlands, particularly after the stabbing of Theo van Gogh. But that gay rights, which is, and I would agree with that, gay rights are kind of a signature achievement of the modern West, but that this signature achievement of the modern West is now threatened by unrestricted Muslim immigration. This was a sort of common trope of the nationalist right in Europe that then got picked up by Donald Trump when he brought that style of politics, or at least became, the first successful presidential candidate to ascend using that style of politics. So go back to the 2016 Republican convention. It's kind of hard to remember now, but there was this very kind of decadent louche party called Gays for Trump, with all of these weird pictures on the wall of these shirtless.
I was there. It was really weird.
With these shirtless twinks in MAGA hats, and a kind of celebration that, these Muslim immigrants are not going to stop us from expressing our liberated sexuality. And this actually made its way into Donald Trump's rhetoric. So after the shooting at the Pulse nightclub by this Omar Mateen, who had pledged allegiance to ISIS, Donald Trump picked up in his rhetoric, we are going to protect our LGBT citizens. He said this in his acceptance speech. Later on, when he first rolled out kind of quote unquote extreme vetting for Muslim immigrants, he specifically said that kind of all immigrants to the United States need to, I'm not getting the exact words here, but need to respect our traditions of social tolerance. Now, I think, fast forward to a decade later, when the politics around gay rights, or at least the politics around gay rights on the right, has really changed. And you see an attempt by this administration, obviously, to completely erase trans people, and not just erase them, but to, take away access to medication, to passports, to employment protections, but also to really erase gay people altogether. I mean, some of you might remember that they took down a webpage about the Enola Gay because it had the word gay in it. And so I think that this should be a reminder to any Jews who are tempted to think that that Donald Trump's attempts to kind of that Donald Trump waging this huge ideological crackdown on our institutions, particularly on our universities, in the name of anti-Semitism, that means that this is a movement that has, not just that has the interests of Jewish people at heart, because I know there's people who don't care. They say, well, as long as he's doing, something that we feel like is in our interests. But this is a movement that I think as the more it is entrenched and able to flourish the less hospitable this country will be for Jewish people.
I just want to pick pick an argument with the idea that this is new. I once wrote a book about Birobidzhan, the Jewish autonomous region in the Soviet Union, which had many uses, but one of its uses was supposed to be as a place to which to exile Jews for their own protection. After the government incited pogroms, having first executed, and this execution did not go off because fortuitously Stalin died just weeks before it was supposed to happen, but Jewish killer doctors who had been poisoning the Soviet elite supposedly were supposed to be executed. This was supposed to foment anti-Semitic violence. And then for their own protection, Jews were going to be exiled to the border with China, where they were going to live in the Jewish autonomous region. Nor is this the only story of a minority that was going to be deported or was deported, like Native Americans during Trail of Tears, for their own protection. So, any leader who claims to know what is better for a group of people, including women, which this administration is also in the business of protecting, is generally suspect.
I want to universalize this phenomenon a little bit. One of the arguments I make in my book last year is that politics since World War II and progressively over the course of time has been characterized by a fundamental moral victory by liberalism in terms of setting the contours of political contestation, right? We don't now typically say, I hate this group and I want to kill them in most advanced Western liberal democracies and win elections on that platform. That gets you branded a bigot. And even people who might agree with you that they don't particularly like that group, they don't say those things anymore, right? And really, in a sense, that's really good, right? I think someone on the last panel said, we're now seeing what it's like when they don't pay lip service to the two-state solution anymore. And I think that's really true. It was better when they felt like they had to. And I think it's better now that people feel like they have to say, we don't hate the Jews as a group. That's great. That's really good. The problem is this rights revolution, this liberal victory, took place too quickly to be complete, right? It just could not be the case that between 1945 and 2025, that we eradicated the foundations of anti-Semitism that had been built in to civilization, Western civilization particularly, but spread quite rapidly in that period of time. It just couldn't go away that quickly. So this needs to get expressed, not in terms of Jews are bad, but in terms of there being good Jews and bad Jews. And this has happened, of course, prior to the modern liberal era. But in the era of liberalism's dominance, that's the only move available if what you want to do is marginalize Jews, or if part of your project involves marginalizing Jews. And this happens now in both right and left-wing varieties of anti-Semitism. Look at the way that Trump gets to say Chuck Schumer's a Palestinian, which should not be a slur, but it is the way that it is and the way that Trump uses it. And him getting to pick who's a good Jew and bad Jew, as Michelle just talked about. And then on the left, in the pro-Palestinian movement, the way that there are codes about what kind of beliefs you're allowed to have as a Jew, and not ones that are morally discriminatory. Like, I think it would be reasonable to say in the pro-Palestinian movement, as a moral baseline, you need to believe that Palestinians deserve a right to a sovereign state and deserve moral equality with Jews. I think that's reasonable. But requiring Jews, in order to be a good Jew, to denounce Zionism writ large, to distance themselves from a political movement that the majority of American Jews, the vast majority of American Jews, still identify with, it's just the same thing that Trump is doing, right? It's trying to pick out your Jewish enemies and cut them out. And I think that's very, very, very problematic.
Look, I moved through the world with a Russian passport, and I don't think there's anything wrong, even though the Putin regime has sentenced me to 8 years in prison in absentia. I don't think there's anything wrong with people requiring that I take a very decisive stand on the Russian genocidal war in Ukraine before I get a right to speak or to be on the same stage with Ukrainians. And I don't see why there's something wrong with requiring Jews to also take that stand. especially in light of the fact that a majority of American Jews are in some way or another affiliated with Zionism.
So here's where I will disagree with my colleague, and I think so. I have compared this in columns I've written in the past to as some of you, again, I'm going to keep going back to these years that were sort of formative for me, but to the anti-Sharia panic of the right after September 11th. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, I have nothing but contempt for religious law. I think that kind of religious authorities should have no power in a secular state. I think that's a fine thing to say. I think it is not fine to do as happened then and has continues to happen up until today, that sort of Muslims as a condition of participation in public life need to prove that they personally disavow Sharia. And so I think that, similarly, however you feel about Zionism, and that's obviously a huge sort of lurking question in the background, there's no question that Judaism as practiced by a majority of Jews in America has a Zionist component, and that plenty of Jews kind of see their Jewish identity as inseparable from a commitment to Zionism or a commitment to a Jewish state. And, that's obviously historically contingent, and you can say that you think that is a sort of a corruption of the religion, or you can disagree with that fact, but you can disagree with kind of the conditions that have led us to this place, but we're in this place. And so I think it's both possible to say, as I have said over and over and over again, not only that I don't think that I think that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same thing, and that I think that conflation, which again, I've been arguing against for years as a sort of technical matter, but increasingly, I think that conflation has become extraordinarily dangerous to our democracy in a way that I could not have previously foreseen. And I think you can say that those two things, I think that you can say that being anti-Zionist is a legitimate political position, but that it is also anti-Semitic to demand that Jews renounce Zionism as a condition of participation in public life.
Adam.
One of my favorite idioms in French is grown-up people can count to two. We know how to count to two, and there's no moral difficulty in simultaneously condemning the atrocities of Hamas and fighting against the far-right regime in Israel, exactly the way we fight against the far-right regime in the United States. Those are not only possible positions, but in a certain sense, essential positions, it seems to me. But if I could, just to roll the argument back to basics a bit, it seems to me that the core issue is that the reason Jews have thrived in liberal states is that liberal states are committed to civil rights, and Jews as a very small, and we should never lose sight of just how small and persecuted and historically persecuted a minority, depend on a broadly expansive idea of civil rights to survive. Jews depend on pluralism in liberal states, and the fact that liberal states embrace pluralism is the reason Jews have felt safe within them. And that's exactly, to come back to Michelle's point, where the Trumpite version of philo-Semitism is not just disingenuous, but flat-out dishonest, because it rejects pluralism, absolutely, as a prime or even as a tolerable virtue. All of the Trumpite ideology says that pluralism isn't a value at all. It's the absence of all values. And therefore, in that way, it has nothing to do, no matter what its frosting may be, with the actual interests of Jews. And just to add, the notion that one can be officially philo-Semitic while being actively anti-Semitic is also one with a long history. G.K. Chesterton, the very great Catholic writer who was a ferocious anti-Semite, like it or not, identified as a Zionist. That's how he spoke of himself, because he meant, get them out of here. That's what Zionist meant, right? Get them out of here and get them someplace else. And so I don't think there's anything startling or shocking about the idea that anti-Semites embrace a perverted form of philo-Semitism. But again, just to return to what seems to me the base, the ground is that Jews need the liberal state because only liberal states guarantee pluralistic civil rights, and therefore Jews are in natural alliance and have been historically with blacks and gays and other minority groups in the pursuit of those pluralistic civil rights.
Okay, so based on that last remark, I think we should, raise the question that's haunted this conference, really, which is the shifting political identities of Jews, including American Jews. Yesterday the panelists. Please, Adam.
What I meant by that was to be, unequivocal, is exactly that when American Jews embrace some form of Trumpism in the form of, if I can only call it paranoid panic, they fail to understand where, if I may put it that way, where their historical interests have always lain, and they are guaranteed to be betrayed by that false confidence.
So that's the question. Is that the correct analysis? We heard last evening that the alliance of Jews and liberalism was a match made in heaven, and it made just tons of sense for a really long time. It connects with this topic of anti-Semitism because Michelle names names in our column, but it seems as if maybe some Jews might be taken in by Trump's anti-Semitism, but maybe some are just moving right, and so there's this big question since it's clear that American Jews have been moving right in the last 50 years or so.
Is that clear though? I think that there's a difference between kind of the leadership of American Jewish institutions. If you look at the, exit polling, from the last election, I think that in every election that I've ever covered, there's been a big prediction that Jews are about to abandon the Democrats. I believe that Jewish women, along with black women, are the only demographic in the last election in which there was no move towards Trump. And so, and Jews still voted for Kamala Harris overwhelmingly. Whether it was in the high 60s or low 70s, I've seen different numbers. But, kind of the fact that we have leaders of Jewish institutions who feel the need to suck up to this administration, I think it gives people a distorted impression of where, and you could also argue that maybe the future of American Judaism is going to move right for demographic reasons, just because of the number of children that kind of secular liberal Jews have versus conservative Orthodox Jews. So that might be our future. But at least in the present, most Jews hate this administration. And most Jews, I think, have a pretty good understanding of where their interests lie. The problem is the totally unrepresentative leaders of too many Jewish institutions.
Do you two share that analysis? Since we've heard from others on this issue, is American Jewish and political identity sort of continuous? And there's no erosion, no move to the right, just a kind of problem with leadership, if it is one, or is there something deeper going on?
I don't know if there's no erosion, right? Like that would depend on some really fine parsing of exit poll data, which just doesn't exist right now. But I will say that the trend, as Michelle just pointed out, has been remarkably steady. I can remember the first time I read an article about how Republicans were about to win the Jewish vote. It was 2004. Guess what didn't happen then? And guess what didn't happen in 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020, or 2024? It's the same thing over and over again. And I feel the same way, by the way, about these demographic transition predictions. It is true that the birth rate is higher among specifically ultra-Orthodox Jews in New York City, right? And that group is increasingly conservative and politically assertive. It is also true that arguments have been made that higher birth rates among religious groups will lead to a political transition and dominance of the political right in the United States for decades at this point. And they keep being wrong, right? And now why they keep being wrong is very interesting. Right? It's because there are significant defections from these very tight-knit, very insular communities. People, they have a lot more kids, but their retention rate is not what they need in order to be able to assert political dominance, right, as a unified bloc. So I am just very cautious about saying, on the basis of extrapolating linear demographic trends, that what has been a fact of American politics for as long as I've been alive, pretty much, is likely to end based on pure speculation. I think, in fact, the evidence suggests, and especially if you look at polling of Trump's approval rating among American Jews right now, that the liberal-Jewish alliance is very, very well-rooted.
Yeah, just to add, if I may, Sam,
please, yeah.
It seems to me that the idea of the liberal Jewish affinity is exactly that it's a match not made in heaven, that it's a match that's made precisely on secular terms. That's formalized in France, of course, where you have a specific idea of laïcité, that you can have a full Jewish identity, but you can't bring it into the public sphere. That's fundamental, the idea that you can be a healthy hybrid. You are Jewish in one sphere, and you play another role as a political citizen. We don't formalize that in the United States in the same way, but we certainly function that way. That is, we have secular identities, Jews do, as lawyers and professors and writers and many other things, and then participate to whatever degree of depth we want as Jews. So it's exactly by not making the match in heaven, by making it on classic, broadly pluralistic secular terms, that is what makes Jews historically feel comfortable in liberal societies.
Russia.
Yeah, I think I just wouldn't be so quick to dismiss the rightward drift as a problem of leadership. It's a problem of institutions. And that's a very significant factor, because that's what, most of this country, which is not Jewish and is not aware that most Jews are disapprove of this administration, that most Jews, by the way, are against the occupation, sees institutional voices as representative of all Jews.
So it's our job, exactly much as public, as writers and thinkers, to make it plain that that's not the case. I mean, that's what we have to bear witness to, and we have to do it, as I think everyone in this panel tries to do, again and again and again, exactly to dissolve that false connection between you're absolutely right, an institutional event and a genuinely popular allegiance.
Jonathan Greenblatt, if you are listening to this panel, the journalists are not pleased. We're not pleased.
Okay, so my time's running out, but I don't think we can leave the formal part of the colloquy without raising something that Michelle said was a huge lurking question, but also that we would never settle today, which is the relationship of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and maybe you can use this opportunity to say something about whether American Jewish political identity is shifting with respect to allegiance to the state of Israel and its policies. And I don't know what the polling says on this one, but anyone at universities can't afford to ignore just the massive generational divide that seems to be emerging on this, at least this particular set of issues. So I'd invite comment on this touchy subject.
I'll go first. So I had a line, right? I used to write about whether Jews can be atheists, and that it was just a descriptive fact that Jews can be atheists because 20% of the Israeli population says they don't believe in God. And if that's the case, then Jews can be atheists because they are. That's just true in the world. So we'd have to accommodate our ideas of theology and religion and ethnic belonging to that fact, rather than try to jerry-rig definitions to say they're no longer Jewish, because obviously they're not. That's crazy. I feel the same way about anti-Zionist Jews, right? There's an attempt by people who identify Judaism with the Israeli state to say, well, they're not real Jews, they're traitors, etc. No, they're Jewish. They are. I may not personally share their beliefs about the conflict or how it ought to be resolved, but that doesn't mean we're not in community together. And that, I think, also speaks powerfully to the question of whether or not anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitism. Of course it can, but it doesn't necessarily manifest in that way. What I'm more worried about is anti-Zionism as a cover for anti-Semitism, and ways in which anti-Zionism can be a recruiting or a sort of pipeline towards anti-Semitic beliefs. I'm sincerely concerned about that. I mean, we see some of that in the ideology of the person who tried to burn down Josh Shapiro's home and kill his whole family on Passover, right? He made a statement that he was doing it in defense of Gaza. But at the same time, it is so easy for the American Jewish mainstream that we've all been criticizing here to use this, or at least the organizations that claim to speak for it, to use this as a justification to dismiss any legitimate criticisms or legitimate debates over what American politics should be towards Israel, or whether or not indeed the United States should be supporting Israel as a client state, or even theoretical conversations about whether the foundation of Israel is a mistake or whether Israel should be sustained. These are all conversations that need to be had openly. And again, my position is that it would be a monumentally disastrous act to try to enact a one-state solution of any form to the Israel-Palestine conflict. It would end in disaster. It would end in mass bloodshed. Given that Israel is a nuclear-armed state on a scale that would be very, very difficult to imagine, the risks would be astronomically high. That does not mean that anyone who disagrees with me should be kicked out of the public sphere or tarred as an anti-Semite. And I think it is very important, if we Jews do enjoy liberalism's blessing, we see that as the font of our support, to be pluralistic in kind. And that means respecting people, especially people from different backgrounds, who come at this issue from a fundamentally different way, who may have family members or entire families who were destroyed in Gaza, and they see Israel and they see Zionism as the bomb that blew up their family home. Those people deserve our respect. They deserve to be taken seriously as moral interlocutors. And just because they say they're anti-Zionist, we should say that they are the new font of anti-Semitism. To me, that is, it's illiberal in its own right.
So I think there are a couple of disambiguations that have to happen, because not only do we, at our peril, conflate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but we also conflate any criticism of the state of Israel and its current policies with anti-Zionism. Right? And so that's the hat trick that the ADL, for example, keeps pulling. When Jonathan Greenblatt says, as he has said, that it's an axiom that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, what he actually means is not even anti-Zionism. What he means is any criticism of the state of Israel. And if we create, or if we continue creating an exception for one state and make it morally unacceptable to criticize this one state, what we're doing is fomenting actual anti-Semitism and also muddying the waters, because the organization that is the trusted source on the levels of anti-Semitism in this country is perpetuating this conflation.
If I may just add, it seems to me there are two different senses of Zionism here. One is we can argue about an ideological fixation in the history, and it's perfectly possible. I've often felt that had I been around as a Jewish intellectual in 1910 or even in Dreyfus's time, I would not have been a Zionist. That would not have seemed to be the right solution to the so-called Jewish problem. But the state of Israel exists now. And I'm putting in mind in the way I'm sure all of us have heard far right-wing and not even very far right-wing Jews constantly disparaging the idea of Palestinian identity. They never existed as a whole. They never had a distinct identity before 1948, on and on in that way. And the point is, it's of no consequence. Whether that's true or not, the point is the Palestinians are a people now who have to be granted their rights and respect now. And in the same way, whether or not we accept the underpinnings of Zionism, Israel is a state filled with human beings and citizens who cannot be disposed of or dispensed with. So one can be, in a real sense, critical of the underpinnings of Zionism, and at the same time recognize that Israelis have exactly the same kinds of human rights and communal rights as any other people on earth.
Michelle.
Well, yeah, I agree that the kind of debate about whether Israel has a quote unquote right to exist is like of much less importance than just the fact that it exists. I also think a lot, the last panel, there was this, I think, very interesting and fruitful discussion about the cognitive dissonance necessary to sustain liberal Zionism, and at the same time, the impracticability, the unworkability of a one-state solution or a state for all its citizens, one-state solution in the kind of utopian sense, as opposed to the one-state solution that actually exists on the ground. But to some extent, these debates are also completely theoretical and are sort of like the debates maybe that people who still had a deep commitment to Marxism were having in the last years of the Soviet Union. I mean, we have actually existing Zionism, and it seems to me that it's perfectly legitimate to not feel a deep allegiance to it as it exists. And the question to me is not, I mean, it's what kind of future those of us who are not Israeli and don't live in the region would like to see in this country or in this region is in some ways subordinate to the question of what relationship are we going to have to the country that exists, in which a country that is starving Gaza right now, you know, that it's been over 50 days since any aid has been allowed in, that is openly planning for ethnic cleansing in Gaza, that is systematically squeezing the communities in the West Bank. And so, you know, I think that there's a form of liberal Zionism that kind of requires us to constantly shift our attention from that to some idealized future image, as opposed to saying, you know, that the more important question is kind of how we are going to relate to this country that exists, not to the country that we think could exist in some better world.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the last question, but please prepare yours because I'm leaving a good amount of time for you to interrogate our journalists. The last question is about you know, liberalism and its possible forms. I mean, one way of hearing some of the answers on the panel, and it's a little unfair, is to hear them as nostalgic. You know, Jews embraced liberalism once. They should stick, you know, it was a marriage made on earth. The marriage should endure.
I mean, I'm 100% nostalgic.
Okay, no, nostalgia is it's a really intelligible response to crisis because you can wish it away. But then there's been a very interesting theme in this conference about maybe the need to, you know, rescue liberalism. Precisely by introducing changes. So I think of the moment when Jim Leffler called for a new liberal approach to pluralism, which he claims has been lacking. Or in the last panel, when Josh Leifer said that liberal Zionism needs to be saved from itself. And so I just wonder, I mean, this is an abstract question, but I'm into it. Do we need to change liberalism in any way to save it in the particular crisis of Jewish history that we've been talking about in this panel? Any takers?
I'll take it on.
Sure.
I'll be the spokesman for absolute nostalgia.
Okay, that's in character.
But I wouldn't call it nostalgia at all. I think that's a derogatory name for what is simply moral continuity of values. It seems to me that what we admire about the liberal ideal, which is in constant state of change because it's committed to reform. And our ideas of reform are of necessity constantly remaking themselves and renewing themselves. And so we're committed to reform and we're committed to renewal. The two things go hand in hand. But specifically, and I would emphasize, is that it is historically only, exclusively, in liberal states that minorities of all kinds have found the possibility of peaceful and, yes, pluralistic coexistence. That's not a fantasy. It's not a nostalgic ideal. It's a fact. It's a fact about human history. And that's true about gays, and it's true about women and the emancipation of women, and it's true about the possibility of an unbeleaguered or a less beleaguered Jewish existence. So I will unapologetically claim not nostalgia, but a firm belief in the continuity of liberal values.
I want to distinguish between two different senses of liberalism that I've in my head termed liberalism as ideology and liberalism as philosophy. Liberalism as ideology is what we commonly call American liberalism. The sort of Walter Lippmann ideas that are now embodied in the Democratic Party. I think that those they've seen better days than they have right now. I think the Democratic Party is racking its brains to try to figure out what it should look like at a moment where Trump is faltering. By the way, the Trump movement is doing very poorly at this moment in time in its quest to destroy American democracy, or at least that is my view. That is not to say it's not threatening, but we're starting to see social backlash and political backlash across all sorts of sectors. So there's a real moment, I think, in the coming years as this project, because the Trump people are so incompetent, not because America is so uniquely virtuous, but they're failing in places that someone like Viktor Orban and Narendra Modi or even Benjamin Netanyahu have found success. So for this liberal ideology, and there are many interesting debates happening over what liberal ideology should look like. I think the abundance movement is one interesting example, at least on economic policy front. But there's also liberalism in the philosophical sense, right? Shayla Ben-Habib gestured towards this earlier, but I mean, since the publication of A Theory of Justice, liberal political philosophy has dominated academia. There's been, honestly, very few serious contenders that have been able to challenge it in the world of academic political philosophy. Rawls has set the terms of the conversation, in part by defining liberalism so capaciously that it's very, very difficult for anyone to stake out a morally respectable position that doesn't fall somewhere under the liberal umbrella. It's extremely possible, or very extremely difficult. And that tradition, right, this very capacious, I find philosophically beautiful, but also arid. If you haven't read A Theory of Justice, it is a tough slog. It has not filtered its way into the discussions about liberal ideology because of its aridness, its abstractness, its inability to inspire passion in a lot of people. Yet it has tremendous intellectual force and tremendous capabilities to adapt itself to different circumstances and different sets of ideas. And so I think if liberalism is to be improved going forward, we will have to draw on elements of liberal philosophy and integrate them into American liberal ideology.
Michelle, do you want to weigh in on this, or Adam?
Just to say that I did a long essay about the limits of Rawlsianism and as it applies to the renewal of liberalism. But I won't bore you with trying to rehearse those arguments now, except to say I agree with you, Zach, that philosophical liberalism is immensely rich, even in a moment when ideological liberalism seems parched. I'd add only that this is scarcely the first time when this is seen manifest. In the 1930s, gifted people, passionately ideological, intellectuals on all sides, felt that liberalism, of all the possibilities that were available, was doomed. It was finished. It had exhausted itself. And that some form either of the Marxist left or of the authoritarian right was the only living and thriving ideology. And the people who stuck nostalgically with liberal philosophical ideas, in retrospect, shine bright in the history of the 20th century. It's why we revere Camus and Orwell. And the people who not just dissented, but dismissed that possibility, who look much more dubious.
Okay, so we're going to transition to questions. I'm just going to mention that Adam has to drop off in 10 minutes, so if you have an urgent question for him, please raise your hand first. Professor Cohen. Right here, right here.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Yes. Okay, too. So my question, really, I think, this panel, first of all, I want to thank the Sam and Maury on the pacing here and the way in which this panel really brought together so many of the threads, and we worked up towards this point. I think that it just a testament to all the hard work they put in. I want to ask a larger question here, which is, who are we talking to? Who are we talking to? And I want to go back to a moment in the conversation in which, to me, spells precisely what I think the crisis is here. Michel says, hey, wait 1 second. The data seems to suggest, sociologically, that business as usual. Jews are still voting for the Democratic Party. And Adam picks that up. He says, yep. And so therefore, what do we need to do? We need to go out and explain to everybody else why the Jews, he's now taking that, there's a kind of aerodynamic feature to that statistic, and then why the Jews in America are different than whatever's going on in Israel per se, not divorced, but different. And they represent the interests of a broader universal project. And what that does is that's exactly why there's no then crisis in liberalism. Because what you then have is, that's the amazing thing about liberalism. If we're going to read Abigail Green's book and David Sorkin's book when they come out, is that liberalism gave Jews the ability to both speak particularly to their interests and to be able to speak universally about broader projects. The problem is I want to go back to Michel's statistics. If we actually look at the statistics, I want to poke three holes in that. The first is the 45% of Jews who voted for Reagan in 1980 and the 35% who voted for Trump are not the same voter. Their levels of attachment to the candidate are radically, radically different. Reagan's base were Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn. That's where his base was. They all were still registered Democrat at that time in 1980. When I say base, I say that's what the Reagan administration says. That's just what's there in the archives. That's how the Republican Party sees it in 1980. The second problem with that statistic is, forget the organizational world. The organizational world is trying to keep up with Ben Shapiro. They're trying to keep up with representational politics, not electoral politics. Jews electorally are so small to begin with, they don't matter. Representationally, that's where they matter. You see it in Europe, you see it in the United States. And representationally, there is no question. Jews are on the right. They're on the right. When they are speaking as Jews, the largest Jewish website, Chabad. That's who controls. Shmuley Boteach and Ben Shapiro. That's who controls what Jews are. So whatever the small difference is between Jewish voters and white voters with high degrees, 5%, that gets washed away in the big, big sea of electoral politics. And so I want to come back to a point that was made about confrontation or engagement. The question is who we're talking to. If there's a crisis, we have to be talking to the Jewish right. That's who we need to be either confronting, like Masha said, or we need to be engaging. But the idea of running with that sociological number is a very dangerous move. It doesn't recognize what the crisis truly is.
Anyone want to comment, weigh in on that? Someone,
I will just say that I have spoken to Ben Shapiro, but he doesn't answer my emails anymore. So,
I'm not sure I guess it kind of depends on what you think the crisis is. It seems to me that Ben Shapiro and his ilk have thrown their lot in with they basically see their enemies as the left, right? And there is no American left without Jews in it. Jews have always been overrepresented among the left. They still are. Any political project to crush the left is going to have a byproduct, either, purposely or not purposely, of crushing a lot of American Jews and kind of fomenting anti-Semitism. But if you fundamentally have a vision of Judaism that you talked earlier about kind of good Jew, bad Jew, but I think, I don't think Ben Shapiro considers the staff of Jewish Currents as co-religionists or as, kind of one people in any sense. And so I don't think he feels any allegiance to them whatsoever. And so, once you've sort of decided that you can write these people off as Jews, then, kind of appealing to him as saying, well, this is going to have a hugely negative effect.
So what I'm saying is we already lost. We won.
Yeah, I just don't think that's true at all. I guess it depends on a model of politics, in which case a certain number of visible representatives constitute the polity or represent the polity or speak for the group in a large sense. And I just think, given all of the facts that Michelle just ran through about the representation of American Jewish and American Jews in left-wing political organizations, the way in which Jews are identified with the left, the way in which Jews populate the upper ranks of the Democratic Party.
It's also extraordinarily likely that the Democratic candidate in 2028 is going to be, you could imagine it being Josh Shapiro, you could imagine it being J.B. Pritzker, you could imagine it being John Ossoff, like a lot of just in terms of, if you're just talking about representation, the face of the Democratic Party is in many ways a Jewish face, which is something that's not really lost on the Trumpist right.
Adam, did you want to weigh in at this point, or?
No, I think.
Okay, Professor Smith.
Just first an observation. I was fascinated, interested in Zack Beauchamp's comments about John Rawls and his influence on social and political philosophy in the last 50 years. And I agree with part of the description, but I just finished teaching a course on a related subject, which comes to a very different conclusion about the influence of Rawls on American culture, but it's another issue. I did want to ask a question, maybe pose a provocation. I've heard a lot of moral hand-wringing about liberalism, about Zionism, about liberal Zionism, about whether or not Trump's philo-Semitism is actually anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've heard a lot of these issues about where Israel is today, and yet I haven't heard there's one very important factor, which to me is decisive for the moment we're in, that I have not heard to which I have not heard a single reference, which is that Gaza and Hamas decided to declare war on Israel on October 7th. And that has not stopped. They continue to hold hostages. They have no intention of giving them up.
Wait, can I
they still regard themselves in being in an existential life and death threat struggle with the Zionist state, Israel. And Israel has to respond to this. And war is brutal. We know that. That's why it's so terrible. And yet, is this Israel's fault?
Yes.
I would like to hear. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We disagree. We disagree. But I want to bring this up because nobody else has said this.
Because people, every time I write about this, and maybe you get these same emails. What about Hamas? Also, I think we should not be aligned with Hamas. So there's nothing praiseworthy or admirable in Hamas. I do think that at this point, Hamas is more willing to make a deal for hostage. I don't think that that's a controversial point. That Hamas is more willing to make a deal to end the war and release the hostages than Netanyahu is. I think that that's something that's widely understood on both sides. But I also think that there's that kind of just abstracting this as war. I think it's true that any country would have responded militarily after October 7th. And it's why I was critical, in some ways wrongly, because I was critical of the people who were protesting, accusing Israel of genocide before it had even started. Its attack after October 7th. But maybe I was like premature. In some ways, you could either say that they were kind of anti-Semitic and assumed the worst of Israel, or you could say that they were prescient. Because at this point, the fact that something was justified doesn't mean that anything was justified. And so there's a discussion about, kind of scale and the laws of war. And I find this question of what about Hamas to be somewhat irrelevant, because I don't think that I think that I think probably most people in this room, maybe I'm assuming too much, will kind of grant the total depravity of Hamas. And it sort of means to me like nothing in terms of justification, again, for what is right now a campaign of starvation waged against an entire civilian population.
And if I could just add that, that the sort of to dismiss this as moral hand-wringing. First of all, I think moral hand-wringing is essential for intellectuals. And when we stop morally wringing our hands, there's something wrong with us. But also, we are living through a moment of the destruction of the post-World War II legal international order, as flawed as it is. But it is, given that the current U.S. administration, the government of Israel, and the government of Russia are among the most active destroyers of this order, and Israel is systematically committing war crimes in Gaza. Also, not a controversial statement. It is not just that war is brutal. Right, and to sort of turn away from that at the moment when the international please don't film when the international legal order is being destroyed is immoral.
Adam, did you want to say something? I have something else I want to say, but I want to give you a chance.
No, go ahead.
Just very quickly, Stephen, I'm worried about this a lot. We can talk about Rawls later. I would love to, but I want to answer the question about Israel. In the weeks following October 7th, I spent a lot of time talking to basically anybody I could find who was willing to weigh in on what a just response to this war would look like, within bounds, military ethicists, military planners, people who understood the politics of what could happen after a war in order to create a more just peace. I was just obsessed with this question. And the answer for what I got looked nothing like what is happening right now. What Israel is doing is not just a moral crime, for all of the reasons that we've discussed so far. It is strategically indefensible, right? What it is doing is destroying its goodwill around the world. It is entrenching itself into a long-term occupation of Palestinian land, or it creating a precipitous withdrawal, in which case it'll be a vacuum, and Hamas or something like it will quickly reoccupy the territory. They have no plan. They have no end game. It's very clear.
I think they do have an end game.
Well, there is the ethnic cleansing, the genocide or ethnic cleansing mass destroy, like kicking everybody out of the territory. That's what Smotrich wants, to be sure. But I don't think, I think Stephen's question presupposes that that's not the end game, right? That Israel is doing something else, is defending itself. That's not defense. That's a war crime. That's genocide. And I think that it is difficult to say. The debate over genocide it's complicated. It's often a red herring, I think, when we can say very clearly what Israel is doing right now is wrong. It is not self-defense. It is not defensible as self-defense. And they could have done otherwise and chose not to. And that is a damning indictment of the Netanyahu government.
Rebecca.
Okay, Adam, I want you to answer before you leave, because I'm going to shift us back to the United States, and I'm going to pick up what Franklin said, that you guys as journalists are writing the first draft, and I have been struck of who you've left out of your first draft. And just the last panel, when Susie was talking about who ran the protests at Columbia, it was not just SJP and JVP. There was 6 other groups. Jews for Ceasefire was enormous within our life. There was tons of other groups, but because Peter Beinart only recognized 2, that's all we talk about. So I think that this is me as a historian. So I would love all the journalists to just say to me, what other stakeholders do you think should have been in this story, or do you wish that you had thought more about? Because what we've heard about in this conference really reflects the media, students, heads of Jewish organizations. I would argue alumni have been critical in understanding the response to what happened on campus. They set up many things in motion. That's for me, but I would love to hear your responses of who you think are other stakeholders, besides we heard about, how Jews vote in this general sense, but there are so many groups who have been left out, and who would you like to see more in the story? Adam, I'm going to let you because you're leaving.
I'm not a journalist in that sense, of someone who goes to Columbia and reports on the various factions that are at play there. what I was going to add to the last question, which I think speaks to this question as well, is that, again, we're grown-up people and we can count to two. I was watched the towers fall on 9/11, and that was an act of absolute evil. And what Al-Qaeda did was utterly indefensible, wrong, and atrocious. But those of us who said at the time, the worst thing we could possibly do is have a violent overreaction where we invade foreign Muslim nations in the fantasy that would somehow bring us peace or bring us revenge. We were all told that we were decadent liberals who didn't understand the militant nature of the 21st century, and I think that's the truth about the Israeli situation as well. But I'd add about the question of who the stakeholders are. Our commitment has to be to a pluralistic society. I keep saying that, but I say it because it's the ground, it's the foundation. And so when kids were being picked up by ICE for holding the wrong positions, in many respects positions I would never agree with, people on this panel might never agree with, but when they were being picked up for holding unsayable positions, it was our absolute responsibility to say, you cannot do that. They have every right to speak out as Palestinians or pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionists. That's what it means to live in a liberal society, even if it costs you something inside because you totally don't agree with it. So making that commitment over and over again to the genuine idea of free speech, even when it costs you something, of value only when it costs you something, it seems to me is those are the stakeholders. That's the stake, and that's what we hold most dear.
If I can just use this opportunity to fact check the last panel, which is also part of what journalists do, we fact check others and we also issue corrections when we're wrong. So, it was said during the last panel that Jewish Voice for Peace issued this reprehensible statement. Now I can't quote it, but I immediately did look it up, and it was not a Jewish Voice for Peace statement. It was an Instagram story that was reposted by the University of Michigan chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace and then immediately removed by Instagram. It's hard for me to answer your question because, like Adam, I was not on the Columbia campus reporting, partly because I was doing other things, including mostly being in Israel-Palestine at that point, but also because it was very difficult for journalists to get to the Columbia campus, because the Columbia campus was immediately shut down. And part of the reason that we know so little about the stakeholders in that protest is because that university, long before it came under such extreme pressure from the current administration, long before this current administration, was intentionally making the protest illegible and intentionally refusing to engage on any intellectual, any speech level with the protesters.
So I just want to why are protests on a campus? It was like 100 kids. Why is that? Why are we fascinated by this? Why is it defining this moment? That's what I was trying to say.
Well, don't you think it has, you would in some ways know better probably than us because you're a professor at Columbia, but there was, so I was at Columbia a couple of times, and in terms of stakeholders who we haven't been talking about, Jews have been overrepresented at all of these protests, right? And there's kind of ways to write them out of the story, to say that they're naive and they're self-hating, but there's just obviously this huge generational divide in which, all of these protests, they had Seders, they had Shabbat, or maybe they didn't have Seders. They definitely had Shabbat, they had all of these. There was a huge Jewish presence, and I think far more, although you can certainly find examples of like gutter anti-Semitism, and then other things that are maybe on the line. If you look at, say, like Mahmoud Khalil, he was always very careful. I don't think that I looked at the file that Canary Mission compiled on him, and they did not find a single anti-Semitic statement. And you would think that if it was out there, they would have found it. There's a lot of statements about Palestinians can't be free until Jewish people are free, or kind of our freedom is mutually interdependent. Again, you might think that's naive, but it's not an environment where a lot of Jews would feel threatened. But the Jews that were part of this movement have been sort of erased. And in what I think has been, you talked about the alumni, there's been so much outrage by alumni and parents. And again, I think part of that is legitimate fear. I've absolutely talked to some Jewish students who felt unsafe and who also felt, I think, a legitimate double standard that, once you kind of do start, as Susie said, once you start policing microaggressions, it's very hard to then turn around and say, well, you should just kind of suck it up because this language can be interpreted in different ways. I think there really was a double standard there, and showed that that this kind of climate, this hypersensorious climate that had prevailed before October 7th was always kind of going to blow up in the left's face. That said, I also think that there was a sort of panic among some in older generations of the Jewish community who saw the size of these protests and felt like their own kids in some cases were being swept up in something that they found, either frightening or appalling, and and we're operating out of a definition of anti-Semitism that is the same thing as we're operating out of a definition of anti-Zionism that's the same thing as anti-Semitism. And they panicked and expected someone to do something about it, and had both, the sort of like financial resources and the bullhorn to turn it into a major national crisis.
Okay, I think there's time for one last question from Daniel Schwartz. Just raise your hand, Dan, so she can give you the mic.
Thank you so much. My question is really for Gessen. You mentioned something, in terms of the conflation of anti-Zionism, or I think you said even criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and that effectively is what somebody like a Jonathan Greenblatt means when he equates anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism. Which could be true. I'm not sure. I mean, he's been all over the place, so I'm not really, sure. But, I would agree that conflation is a problem. I see conflations of that type, to be honest, as very un-Jewish, in terms of not making clear and fine distinctions. But I'd be curious to hear you maybe say more about like the use of metaphorical language. I'm thinking about your essay in late 2023 in the New Yorker. Because metaphorical language, it kind of steps right up there, gets very close, and I guess then the question can be, when you use a phrase like the ghetto is being liquidated, is there still a kind of difference that still is being foregrounded there, or was that difference lost? I think that for me is a question.
Well, I think that's a fair question to. First of all, I wouldn't call it metaphoric language. It's an intentional comparison, and in any comparison contains similarities and differences. And you're absolutely right. The writer decides whether to foreground the differences or the similarities. My task, my goal was to foreground the similarities. I can lay out to you the many similarities between Gaza and a ghetto in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe. And the sequence of events that were contained in a ghetto liquidation in Eastern Europe were actually precisely repeated by Israel in its onslaught on Gaza.
So Michelle was right. We didn't settle everything, but the end has come, and I know Maury wants to say some concluding words. I want to thank him as the co-organizer, but honestly organizer of this conference, and especially these panelists who have been so generous with their time and thought.
Yeah. And let me also thank the panelists. That was just a fantastic end to a really interesting day and a half of discussion. And I think, in a sense, we reclaimed the study of anti-Semitism, showing that it's not just a political tool, but also an object to think with, to debate with, to argue about. And I thank all of you, all the people who came, who spent their time, who really engaged with these questions so seriously. Incredibly grateful. I think it was a great model for how to discuss these issues in a really civil and productive way. I also really want to thank Linda Maisels and Inessa Leskova. A round of thanks. Who just made everything run so beautifully. And thanks again to Sam for all the help. And I'll just invite the panelists, the chairs, and their guests to come up here and say thank you again to everyone. Thanks.